It's the 2nd of August 1944 and Operation Overlord has been in full swing for 58 gruelling days. Nearly 3 million men have been fighting it out on both sides, 500,000 of whom will never leave Normandy. Yet, none of them notice a new and unproved type of aircraft watching them from above. The first ever reconnaissance aircraft powered by jet engines. The invasion of Normandy had been a preoccupation of the Allies for over a year, and the liberation of France a hope for millions since 1940. In preparation for Operation Neptune, the landings on the 6th of June 1944, and the planned push into the French heartland, one group of men had been invaluable: the photo reconnaissance pilots of the Allied air forces. Having wrestled control of French skies through a combination of awesome industrial might, an expansive pilot training program, and the targeting of the Luftwaffe's ability to fight, namely through the point-blank directive, Allied generals had a clear picture of the battlefield. Although endowed with plenty of reconnaissance aircraft themselves, the Germans could not freely fly over the Normandy front in daylight. The bomber and fighter reconnaissance aircraft either risked being shot down or had to engage in lightning low-level missions, which yielded less intelligence. German commanders were desperate to know what was happening over the other side of the hill, and so the Luftwaffe pressed two of their new twin-jet Arado Ar 234s into service as photo reconnaissance planes. This is their little-known story. When the Allies landed on the Normandy beaches, the Luftwaffe, in theory, had enough aircraft to photograph their movements across the battlefield. On D-Day, Luftflotte 3, stationed in France, possessed 4 long-range reconnaissance Gruppen with a total of 60 aircraft. These were made up of Junkers Ju-88s, Ju-188s and Messerschmitt Me-410s. In addition to these converted bombers and heavy fighters, the Germans also had on hand a tactical reconnaissance grouper with 42 Messerschmitt Bf-109s. These fighters had had their armament stripped down and been modified to carry cameras. Despite having the aircraft available, putting them into the skies over Normandy just wasn't feasible. The Allied air cover over the French region was too thick, and German twin-engine reconnaissance aircraft lacked the performance to penetrate it during daylight. So, just as the RAF had done in the early days of the war, they reverted to night missions. If you want to hear more about that, then please watch my video on that decision after this one. As you might imagine, night photographs, with the aid of flares dropped from the aircraft, gave far less information than those taken by day. Single-engine reconnaissance fighters, even without their heavy armament, also couldn't operate at normal photo reconnaissance altitudes. Instead, they flew low-level photographic missions over Allied positions by day. When they did risk a peek over the enemy's backyard, they were normally rewarded with a high-speed dash for home, pursued by defending fighters. This all resulted in a limited view of the developing battle for the Germans. Despite the bravery of these Luftwaffe pilots in flying these missions, it did little good to prepare their comrades on the ground. Indeed, the Germans were not able to prevent the Americans' breakout in July 1944 along the Cherbourg Peninsula, or even prepare for it. By the time it became apparent on the ground, the initiative had been firmly given to the Allies. But the Germans weren't completely beaten when it came to photo reconnaissance, and they still had an ace up their sleeves. Not long after the invasion began, a new air reconnaissance unit was formed, and command was given to Oberleutnant Horst Goetze. This unit, known as the Versuchsverband Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, or Headquarters Unit, would receive its orders directly from Luftwaffe High Command. Setting up shop at Oranienburg near Berlin, Goetze took delivery of 2 new single-seat twin-jet Arado Ar 234A reconnaissance bombers. In fact, they were the 5th and 7th prototype of the new jet. These specific aircraft were fitted out with 2 50cm focal length reconnaissance cameras, which were housed in the rear fuselage. They were laid out so that they would give excellent coverage over the ground below, slightly overlapping each other's camera views. The Arado was possibly the best choice for a photo reconnaissance aircraft at that point in the war. Not only could it fly at 30,000 feet and above, but also at speeds in excess of 450 miles per hour. No wonder the Germans were confident that it could penetrate the Allied fighter defences with impunity. However, even with this level of confidence in the aircraft, actually operating the things would be a huge headache for Goetze. Launching his first operational mission would take every organisational bone in his body and all his initiative. As he was dealing with hand-built prototypes, getting hold of spares was a constant problem, as only one place could provide them, the designers themselves. In addition, the aircraft had not progressed far enough along the development process for a technical manual to have been produced. This left the ground crew in a position where they had to learn on the job and having to react to unknown issues that developed in the aircraft. Moreover, there were no pilot notes for the Arados, and certainly no dual-control trainers. Goetz and his second-in-command, Lieutenant Erich Sommer, essentially became test pilots and had to teach themselves to fly the new aircraft. This included getting to grips with the handling of its temperamental, early production Jumo 004 jet engines. This may have sounded fairly straightforward for two experienced pilots, but the Arado AR-234A was like no other aircraft they would have ever flown before. Fast as it was in the air, the AR-234A's twin Jumo jet engines didn't generate enough thrust to get the fully laden aircraft off the ground. To help with this, the designers had fitted two rocket pods under the wings, each of which developed 1,100 pounds of thrust for 30 seconds. Once the fuel was exhausted, the pods were jettisoned and fell slowly to Earth by parachute. They were then retrieved for reuse. This was the first oddity associated with the AR-234. Another steep learning curve for the would-be recon pilots was the jet's undercarriage. In a bid to make space available for extra fuel tanks, the designers had abandoned a conventional undercarriage. Instead, takeoff was achieved with the help of a wheeled trolley that was released on liftoff and remained on the ground. When landing, the Arado's pilot would deploy sprung skids that extended below the fuselage and engine nacelles. This was a very similar approach taken by the designers of the ME-163 Comet. The issue was that while the AR-234A could land on almost any airfield, once there, it may not be able to take off again. Goetz's unit only possessed two of the takeoff trolleys, and having been hand-built, they were not interchangeable between the two aircraft. This oversight was not fully appreciated until the Arados went into action. Due to the rapidly deteriorating situation in Normandy, Goetz and his unit were pressed into action earlier than they probably should have been. On the 25th of July, the two AR-234As took off from Oranienburg and headed for their operational base at Juvincourt near Reims. During the flight, Goetz's aircraft suffered an engine failure, and he was forced to deviate to the nearest airfield with both spare engines and a landing trolley, which of course was only Oranienburg. Pressing on, Erich Sommer managed to find the French airfield without incident, and after a hasty landing, the Arado was quickly loaded up on a vehicle and hidden away from the prying eyes of Allied planes. Rather than getting into the air as soon as possible to collect the vital intelligence needed to stem the Allied onslaught, Sommer just sat around doing nothing. As there was only one trolley to help the aircraft take off, it had to be transported from Oranienburg, where he'd left it on the 25th, to Juvincourt. However, because of the constant threat of Allied fighters, the trolley and other vital supplies such as the rocket pods could not be flown in by aircraft. Instead, they were sent via the heavily mauled French railways, which took over a week. By this time, the Allies had pushed through the German lines in the west and were advancing rapidly. Finally, on the morning of the 2nd of August, the AR-234A was ready for its first combat mission. The ground crew had manoeuvred the jet onto its trolley and then towed the unique-looking aircraft to the downwind end of the bomb-crated Mark airfield. Juvincourt was well known to the Allies and had been hit numerous times before. Sommer climbed into the small cockpit with its excellent forward visibility and gingerly strapped in. Going through the usual checks, no doubt with added haste given the vulnerable position he was in, he then fired up his two jet engines. As the engine temperatures settled down, he released the brakes and eased forward the throttles. Accelerating the jet slowly across the grass field and observing that it was handling as it should be, Sommer engaged the buttons to ignite the booster rockets. When the rockets developed full thrust, he felt a reassuring push in the small of his back, and the Arado accelerated more quickly. At 100 miles an hour, the nose wheel lifted off the ground and the aircraft became eager to get airborne. At this point, Sommer pulled the mechanical release for the takeoff trolley, which when detached, allowed the aircraft to lift smoothly off the ground. The trolley was soon followed by the booster rockets, which, when their fuel was exhausted, was released by Sommer. The first ever jet reconnaissance mission was on its way. Sommer turned slowly in the direction of the port of Cherbourg and put the Arado into a climb of 250 miles per hour and established an initial 2,500 feet per minute rate of climb. After about 20 minutes, the Arado was at its operational altitude of 34,000 feet. Despite the jet's speed, it was still vulnerable to attack. Sommer had a front row seat to the French countryside in front of him, but had a large blind spot behind the cockpit. In order to spot Allied fighters before they saw him, he weaved from side to side every now and then to get a glimpse over his tail. Sommer also needed to make sure the Arado wasn't producing a condensation trail behind it. something that would have betrayed his position immediately to the enemy. As the flight continued, he didn't encounter either threat. Sommer soon arrived over Cherbourg and prepared himself for the first camera run. Turning to the east, he slowly eased the nose down to build up speed. At 460 miles per hour, he levelled the plane out, arriving at 32,300 feet. Quickly engaging a switch, the shutters of the plane's two cameras clicked into life, opening at 11-second intervals. Each shot would photograph a 6-mile wide view of the battlefield below. It was a perfect day for the mission, clear and sunny, with limited cloud to obscure the photography of the invasion beaches below. 32,000 feet up, Sommer could not see the men below in their life and death struggle, and they certainly could not see him. Nor, would it seem, could any patrolling Allied fighters in the area. At least, if they did, they never got close enough for Sommer to see them. For the next 10 minutes, Sommer kept his course and photographed every inch of the coast along the Normandy front. Then he turned starboard through a semicircle and flew a second run 6 miles inland and parallel to the first. After another 10 minutes, he turned east again to cover the next 6-mile track even further inland. Just before he reached the end of the third run, the film in the camera's magazines ran out. The most precarious part of the mission was now over, but the task was not finished and the danger was by no means done. At all cost, he had to return to base with the precious film. Hurtling back across Normandy to the base at Geforce, Sommer was greeted with flares which were lit to help the jet pilot find the airfield. Conscious of the risk of fighters in the area, he dropped the jet into the landing pattern at high speed, extending the skids and neatly landed the Arado on the grass. Sommer would later say that on skids the plane made a very smooth landing on the grass, much smoother than with a conventional wheeled undercarriage on our runway. Almost even before the jet came to a full stop, it was swarmed by men coming from all over the airfield. Paying little attention to the hero of the hour, the ground crew went straight for the cameras. Once the hatch above the rear fuselage was unlocked and opened, the film magazine was hastily unclipped, lifted out and quickly sent away for development. Next, to keep the Arado safe, it was hoisted onto its takeoff trolley and towed back to the hangar. No doubt a little befuddled by all this sudden activity, Sommer probably didn't realise at the time what he'd just achieved. In a single 90-minute flight, the pilot had single-handedly provided more intelligence than the entire Luftwaffe reconnaissance force in the West had been able to do over the previous 58 days. The 380 photographs that Sommer bravely captured for the Germans had documented almost every part of the Allied line with their up-to-date locations all across Normandy. It was vital information that German High Command desperately wanted. The 12-man team of Luftwaffe photo interpreters at Geforce took more than 2 days to produce an initial analysis of the photographs, and detailed examination of the prints took weeks. The same day that Sommer completed his epic flight, Oberleutnant Goetz landed his own Arado at Geforce. Now with 2 aircraft on strength, the unit was put to work by German High Command. The 2 jet planes flew 13 further missions during the following 3 weeks. They flew without opposition over various targets in France, which provided the Germans with a detailed account of the Allied advance. However, it was all a little too late. By the 17th of August, the Allies had entered Chartres and Orléans. The infamous Falaise Pocket was forming, which threatened to encircle the entire German army group in Normandy. The Germans were forced to first withdraw and then mount a full retreat. Any decisive intelligence the Arado pilots could gather for their superiors was long since over, and they merely documented the loss of Normandy. When American tanks advanced on Geforce itself on the 28th of August, Goetz received orders to withdraw his units to Sèvres in Belgium. The unit's time over Normandy was over. Although on the face of it this unit's operations over the invasion beaches might not seem that remarkable, the fact that they were never intercepted and almost never mentioned in Allied communications or intelligence was. While their photographs may not have saved the Germans from defeat, the continued Allied ignorance of their operations was the greatest compliment that could possibly be paid to the skillful way in which Erich Sommer and Horst Goetz performed their duties. The 2 pilots had expertly completed their task, and I think it's a story worth telling. Goetz and his unit were by no means dumb, and in early September took possession of the new Arado Ar-234B reconnaissance aircraft. Thankfully, this version was fitted with a normal tricycle undercarriage, which allowed them to operate from any airfield they found themselves on. Although the Arado Ar-234B was 24 miles per hour slower than the prototypes and had a slightly shorter range, it didn't stop Goetz and his Arados from ranging far and wide over Allied territory with little interference for the remainder of the war. Luckily for the Allies, the Arado Ar-234As came slightly too late to really affect the Normandy invasions. Perhaps if they had been available to fly reconnaissance missions a couple of months earlier in time for D-Day, there's little doubt that armed with those vital photographs, German field commanders would have deployed their forces much more effectively than they were able to with the fog of war. It's even possible that Eisenhower would have reached into his other pocket and pulled out the alternative speech he was hoping never to give following the D-Day landings. What do you think? Let me know in the comments, and if you've enjoyed the video, please give it a like to help it spread to others. And seeing that you got this far, why not watch my other video about another German jet on screen now?